The moment struck like a fault line splitting open beneath the chamber. Conversations died mid-sentence, camera lenses froze mid-blink, and even the lights above seemed to hesitate as Ron Johnson leaned into the microphone and spoke words no one in that room had ever expected to hear. For a man known for his hard angles and sharper dismissals, the sudden softness in his voice felt unnatural, almost eerie, like the air before a storm that no one had predicted. Jasmine Crockett didn't move at first. Her eyes narrowed, her posture steady, her breath controlled. She had walked into this debate prepared for every insult, every deflection, every rehearsed talking point Johnson usually hurled like a shield. But this quiet admission, this almost reluctant alignment, caught even her off guard. You could see it in the slight arch of her eyebrow, the flicker of recognition passing across her face. Around them, the audience shifted as if pulled by a single thread. A sea of stunned expressions, one collective inhale. Chairs creaked. Someone whispered a confused "Wait, did he just—" But no one dared finish the thought. Then came the silence, dense, electric, trembling with disbelief, before the first ripple of reaction began to form. But to understand why this single sentence from Ron Johnson sent shockwaves across the chamber, we need to go back to where the tension truly began. The weeks leading up to the debate had unfolded like a slow-motion unraveling, with violence overseas escalating into a storm that none of the world's diplomats seemed capable of calming. Every headline screamed catastrophe. Every televised hearing devolved into the same circular accusations, and the public, already worn thin by years of turmoil, felt the weight of each new crisis like another stone added to a growing pile. In this climate, the upcoming debate was treated less like a forum for solutions and more like a predictable carnival of sound bites and posturing. Both Senator Rowan Hale and Representative Janelle Carter entered the arena carrying reputations that guaranteed friction. Hale, hardened by years of ideological trench warfare, viewed compromise as surrender. Carter, known for her relentless advocacy and sharp clarity, represented a challenge he could neither dismiss nor easily overpower. Their history of public clashes had become a kind of political folklore, replayed and rehashed by networks hungry for conflict. Peace, in this moment, was not just a policy proposal, it was a battleground of narratives. To some, it signified strength. To others, capitulation. The nation's pulse quickened every time the word was uttered, as if the very idea carried echoes of all the broken promises that had come before. So when the debate approached, expectations sank to their lowest point. Commentators predicted fireworks, but no illumination, confrontation without clarity. Few believed anything meaningful could emerge from two figures so defined by their opposition. Yet beneath the predictable cynicism, an intangible tension lingered, something unspoken, humming beneath the surface, as though both Hale and Carter sensed the ground shifting in ways neither had prepared for. Ron Johnson had never been the sort of politician people described as flexible. If anything, his reputation was carved from the opposite, a relentless contrarian streak, a tendency to dig in his heels long after everyone else had moved on. Supporters called it conviction. Critics called it obstinacy. But whichever side people claimed to stand on, there was no denying that Johnson carried himself with the kind of certainty that left little room for nuance, let alone second thoughts. His clashes over the years became part of the congressional landscape, sharp remarks that cut deeper than he intended, dismissive gestures during hearings that resurfaced in endless highlight reels. Commentators dissected moments when he appeared more interested in scoring rhetorical points than listening to expert testimony. Each time he brushed off criticism with the same familiar smirk, the quiet arrogance threading through his responses, as though the world simply hadn't caught up to his understanding of how things truly worked. Yet the last several months had exposed cracks in the armor he'd spent years reinforcing. A miscalculated interview here, a poorly timed statement there, and suddenly the headlines shifted from portraying him as a stubborn firebrand to a figure increasingly out of step with the national mood. Poll numbers dipped, all eyes kept their distance. Even some longtime supporters hesitated to defend his latest remarks. He could feel it, an isolation tightening around him like an invisible noose. Behind closed doors, the frustration simmered. He wasn't used to being on the defensive and certainly not accustomed to watching his influence shrink in real time. Every attempt to regain footing seemed to backfire, feeding the perception that he was spinning rather than leading. The pressure grew heavier with each passing week, the political spotlight turning harsh and unforgiving. So when he stepped onto that debate stage, he carried more baggage than he allowed anyone to see. The rigid posture and the practiced dismissiveness, these were habits he clung to, even as the ground beneath him shifted. He was a man cornered by consequences he'd never imagined would catch up to him, grasping for a way to reclaim relevance before it slipped completely from his grasp. But while Johnson's world was shrinking, Jasmine Crockett's was rapidly expanding, and for reasons few understood at the time. Janelle Carter's rise began long before she ever stepped foot in the halls of power, long before the cameras, long before the speeches, long before the nation began whispering her name with a mixture of admiration and intrigue. She started and packed community centers and now courthouse hallways, working as an attorney who refused to see clients as case numbers or file folders. The stories she defended, families displaced, workers exploited, voices silenced, etched themselves into her memory and shaped the steel beneath her calm demeanor. Civil rights work taught her how deeply wounds could run, but also how fiercely people fought for dignity when given even a sliver of hope. Janelle never raised her voice to command attention. She guided it with precision. In debates, she didn't lunge or posture. She dissected. She revealed. She made arguments feel less like confrontations and more like undeniable truths emerging from the haze. People often asked where her composure came from, and she always answered the same way: discipline. Years of learning when to speak, when to listen, and when to refuse to look away. It was this discipline and the empathy that powered it that distinguished her from opponents who relied on spectacle. Where others saw politics as theater, Janelle saw it as stewardship. Her plan for peace was born from that belief. While others clamored for escalation, she studied the fractures beneath the conflict. She traced the pathways of suffering, the economic desperation, the diplomatic failures, the forgotten promises. Her proposal blended diplomacy with humanitarian aid, relief with rebuilding, incentives with accountability. It was ambitious, yes, bold even, but grounded in a philosophy she'd lived her entire career. Real peace requires more courage than war. Critics called it idealistic. She called it necessary. What lent her vision such gravity wasn't just her policy background. It was her story. Janelle had grown up watching neighbors uprooted by violence abroad and instability at home. She remembered translating letters for families navigating asylum cases, seeing both fear and stubborn hope in their eyes. Those memories refused to fade, shaping her into someone who could speak about peace without sounding detached or naive. She spoke with the weight of someone who had witnessed what people were willing to endure just to feel safe. That authenticity drew people in. It made them listen. It made her voice impossible to dismiss. And yet, despite her clarity, the night of the debate would test her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The debate's opening rounds unfolded with a crackling intensity, each exchange landing like a spark on dry tinder. Rowan Hale wasted no time sharpening his rhetoric, leaning heavily into barbed phrasing meant less to persuade and more to provoke. He tossed out dismissive comments with the ease of someone long accustomed to controlling the tempo, injecting just enough derision into his tone to stoke irritation without crossing into outright hostility. It was a familiar dance for them: bait, jab, retreat. Janelle Carter, however, refused to bite. She maintained her posture with a stillness that was almost unnerving, her hands folded, her gaze steady. Where Hale scattered his arguments like volleys, she waited, absorbing each claim with the quiet focus of someone preparing to turn the momentum rather than chase it. Moderators tried to keep the pace balanced, but the air thickened with the tension of two worldviews colliding. Then Hale finally went after her peace plan. A scoff slipped out before he even finished the question, followed by a dramatic lift of his eyebrows as though he couldn't fathom how such an idea had gained any traction. "Your plan," he said, with a tone coating every syllable in skepticism, "sounds more like a wish list than a strategy. Diplomacy without leverage, aid without accountability. Do you honestly expect anyone to believe that's feasible?" The audience reacted in ripples. First a few murmurs, then an uneasy rustling through the seats. Some leaned forward, anticipating a clash. Others exchanged glances that hovered between curiosity and dread. Hale smirked at the reaction, clearly pleased with the pressure he'd just applied. Janelle didn't flinch. If anything, the challenge seemed to sharpen her. A subtle shift in her posture signaled the change. Her shoulders squared, her breath steadied, and the faintest glimmer of determination surfaced in her eyes. She had spent weeks anticipating this exact moment, preparing for every angle of dismissal, every condescending flourish Hale might deploy. As the murmurs settled into a frantic silence, she lifted her chin, ready to reshape a broom with a single sentence. When Janelle finally spoke, her first line sliced through the noise, and suddenly Rowan Hale wasn't smirking anymore. Janelle Carter let the silence settle for a moment longer, allowing every eye in the chamber to land on her. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it carried with a clarity that cut straight through the haze left behind by Rowan Hale's dismissive challenge. "You're asking if peace is feasible?" she began, as though the alternative has ever offered us anything but more suffering. The sentence hung in the air like a dropped hammer. Hale shifted in his seat. The audience leaned in, drawn by the steadiness with which she delivered the words. She continued, laying out the global stakes with a precision that felt almost surgical. She spoke of fractured alliances, of humanitarian corridors abandoned too soon, of communities caught in the crossfire of conflicts they never chose. She traced the timeline of escalation not through talking points, but through lived consequences: families displaced, cities hollowed out, children growing up beneath the shadow of air raid sirens instead of classrooms. Every point she made was deliberate, every pause was purposeful. "Lavrant," she said, turning Hale's word back toward him, "is not about who can shout the loudest or who can flex the biggest threat. Leverage is earned through trust, through resources, through the willingness to rebuild what violence has destroyed." A ripple swept through the room. Surprise, recognition, something hard to name. Hale stiffens, clearly expecting a defensive rebuttal, not a redefinition of the very terms he had weaponized. But Janelle wasn't countering his narrative, she was replacing it. She moved through the components of her plan: diplomatic partnership, targeted aid, economic infrastructure aimed at preventing desperation from becoming ignition. With each point, her confidence grew, not as a performance, but as a truth she had lived and shaped and believed in long before this stage. "Peace is not passive," she said, eyes locking on to Hale's. "It is the most demanding form of courage a nation can show." The room fell utterly silent. Hale opened his mouth to interrupt. Habit, reflex. But something in her expression stopped him. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't triumph. It was conviction, steady and unshakable. And for the first time that night, he faltered. Janelle pressed forward. You call this a wish list, but escalating violence is what has failed. Escalation has never delivered stability. Escalation has never delivered safety. Escalation has only delivered generations of grief. And you know that, Senator. You know it because you've seen the reports just as I have. You've read the briefings. You've met the families. Hale blinked, caught between pride and an unfamiliar tug of conscience. And if we don't change course now, we won't just inherit the consequences, we'll be the authors of them. A heavy, unsettling tension settled over the chamber. Viewers watching at home would later describe it as the moment the air shifted. The moderators exchanged glances, unsure if they should intervene or simply witness what was unfolding. Janelle leaned slightly forward. So I'll ask you this. If we know the cycle is broken, why insist on repeating it? Why reject the possibility of peace before we've even dared to try? The question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't theatrical. It was sincere. So sincere that it disarmed the very man it targeted. For the first time all evening, Rowan Hale didn't have a retort. A low murmur rolled through the audience. Few heads turned in Hale's direction, waiting, anticipating. He didn't speak. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickered downward, and his fingers tapped nervously against the podium. Janelle had done more than counter his arguments. She had shifted the ground beneath him. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 3. Then Hale inhaled slowly, as though wrestling with something he had never expected to confront in public, something that sounded suspiciously like truth. I can't argue with that. Gasps erupted across the chamber. Someone in the back actually stood up in disbelief. Even the moderators froze. Hal steadied himself and looked directly at Janelle. Your plan, your approach, it's right. It's the only thing that makes sense at this point, and I endorse it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. It felt as if time had stalled, suspended between shock and comprehension. Then the room exploded. Applause detonated from one side, followed by shouts of astonished approval from the other. Some audience members clapped with both hands pressed over their mouths. Others stared in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A few shook their heads, not in disagreement, but in the dazed awe of people watching history pivot in real time. Hale exhaled, shoulders dropping, as if releasing months of stubborn resistance in a single breath. Janelle remained still, absorbing the tidal wave of reaction without basking in it. The moment belonged not to victory, but to revelation. But the room wasn't the only place that exploded. Within minutes of the debate's closing gavel, the digital world ignited as though someone had struck a match in a room soaked with gasoline. Clips of Ron Hale's unexpected endorsement of Janelle Carter's peace plan shot across platforms with breathtaking speed. One 20-second snippet, AO pausing, swallowing hard, and saying, "I can't argue with that," was shared so rapidly that it became the #1 trending video before the debate's official recap even aired. Hashtags erupted in every corner of the internet. One championed Carter's composure, another marveled at Hale's reversal, and a third simply expressed disbelief that the moment had actually happened. Memes flooded timelines within the hour. Hale's stunned expression captioned with lines like, "When your opponent brings facts instead of fury." Others showed before and after comparisons of his posture, humorously charting the path from defiance to reluctant respect. Influencers seized the moment with equal parts enthusiasm and astonishment. Analysts posted frame-by-frame breakdowns, communication experts dissected Carter's rhetorical precision, and conflict reporters praised the boldness of her de-escalation strategy. Even entertainers chimed in, pulling quotes from the exchange and setting them to dramatic music, highlighting the emotional weight of the night. News outlets scrambled to adjust their narratives. Pundits across the political spectrum appeared on screen in urgent tone, some marveling at Hale's willingness to cross a line few believed he ever would, others accusing him of abandoning long-held stances for a fleeting moment of moral clarity. Debate flared instantly, but one point cut through the chaos with surprising consistency. Whether one admired or despised the decision, Carter's argument had been airtight. Her logic hadn't just held, it had reshaped the entire conversation. Commentators agreed that Hale's endorsement, far from overshadowing her, had amplified her message. It sent a signal, not just of bipartisan acknowledgement, but of a deeper shift in the country's appetite for something other than endless escalation. And as analysts replayed the clip in slow motion, highlighting the precise second Hale's posture softened, the national conversation swelled beyond the confines of partisan reactions. Hour by hour, the moment grew larger, heavier, impossible to dismiss. And by sunrise, one realization became impossible to ignore. As the sun rose on the morning after the debate, the noise of punditry and online frenzy faded just enough for the deeper truth of the moment to come into focus. Beneath the shock, beneath the spectacle, something profoundly human had unfolded on that stage. For a brief, crystalline instant, calm had overtaken chaos, and truth had cut through ego with the quiet clarity of a steady flame in a dark room. It wasn't just that Janelle Carter had won an argument. It was that she had demonstrated a form of leadership rooted in dignity rather than domination. People across the country began to recognize it. Comment sections filled with reflections from ordinary viewers who had grown tired of watching representatives speak past each other. They wrote about how Carter's restraint hadn't weakened her conviction, it had strengthened it. How her refusal to escalate, to match volume with volume, had revealed a courage that felt rare in a time defined by division. Even some of her staunchest critics acknowledged, however grudgingly, that the moment had carried an unexpected grace. What resonated most was not the endorsement itself, but the path that led to it. Carter had offered a model of responsibility that didn't rely on fear or fury. She had framed peace not as an abstract ideal, but as a collective task, one that demanded empathy as much as strategy, compassion as much as resolve. In doing so, she reminded the nation that leadership can be both firm and humane, that strength and kindness are not opposites, and that unity does not require uniformity. For many viewers, it felt like rediscovering something they didn't realize they'd lost, a sense that change was still possible, that people could still listen, and that integrity could still move hearts in a world numbed by conflict. It wasn't naive optimism. It was a flicker of hope rekindled by the undeniable impact of a single, clear voice refusing to surrender to cynicism. But there's one final piece you need to hear. That moment, the stunned silence, the jaws dropping, the eruption of applause, wasn't just political theater. It was a reminder that dignity still cuts through distortion, that truth still reaches people even when the world feels deaf, and that peace, when spoken with courage, can shift the course of an entire room. Jasmine Crockett proved it, Ron Johnson confirmed it, and we all witnessed it. If that moment moved you, don't let it end here. Be part of the movement that chooses clarity over chaos and compassion over cynicism. Share this story, amplify the message, and bring more people into the conversation about what real leadership looks like. Subscribe, stay engaged, and keep showing up for the moments where justice and integrity rise above the noise. Because history isn't just something we watch, it's something we create together. Your voice matters, and this movement grows stronger every time someone chooses hope to rise.